Hi everyone! In this video, I'm going to focus on the three regions of the brainstem. So the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. You'll see that the medulla really just blends imperceivably into the spinal cord. And so on that note, anatomically speaking, you actually do see a similar structure in the brainstem as you do to the spinal cord. But one anatomical as well as functional difference is that we do see nuclei embedded in the white matter here of the brainstem. And again, remember the nuclei are bundles of cell bodies in the central nervous system. So a key thing to keep in mind with all three of these regions is that they are, first of all, some of the most primitive regions of the brain. So even reptiles have a basic functioning brainstem. And a reason for that is because we are going to see that cardiac functions, respiratory functions, functions that are critical to maintaining our consciousness are going to be controlled here in this brainstem. So to get a better view at the three components of the brainstem, I love this graphic. So the purple is showing the diencephalon, which we visited in the last video. So the thalamus, the hypothalamus, thalamus, they almost look like Mickey Mouse ears here, thalamus, and then the, let's see, hypothalamus is shown. You can see it a little bit right there. But to focus on the brainstem, so midbrain, pons, medulla, those are the colors used to illustrate these regions in this picture. So the midbrain is here in the ventral view, and from a sagittal view, you can see it here. So it's going to include the two colliculi, superior and inferior. With the pons, pons means bridge. The trigeminal nerve, which controls muscle movements in the mouth. It also controls sensations going to your face. So if your dentist numbs your parts of your teeth, they're actually numbing up and blocking branches of the trigeminal nerve. And so that's a really distinct anatomical feature coming from the pons. And I'll talk more about this in a moment. And then last of these three regions, you have the medulla oblongata. Usually it's affectionately referred to simply as the medulla. A key cranial nerve that you see branching from this region is the vagus nerve. Vagus nerve is pivotal to parasympathetic nervous system and control. The vagus nerve, you'll see, actually plays a big role in regulating digestive function. It has branches that innervate the heart and control or actually lower your heart rate. So some really important things stemming from this brainstem. So to start looking at the midbrain in a bit more detail, so it's going to sit between the diencephalon, this is the thalamus once again, and the pons, which has been cut in this view. So one question that I had is this the dorsal or the ventral view? And hopefully you arrived at the dorsal view. So the cerebellum has been removed here. And what we're seeing is the pineal gland. And then here, part of the midbrain again is going to be this corpora quadrigemina. So gemina means referring to twins. So Gemini, quad meaning four. So it's a pair of four bodies, corpora. And so 1, 2, 3, 4. So you have the superior colliculi and you have the inferior colliculi. So these colliculi contain nuclei that are actually going to be key to the startle reflex. The superior colliculi is going to be key to visual reflexes, whereas the inferior is going to be key to auditory reflexes. So if you hear the loud sound, your reflex is to turn and face that sound, to direct your attention to it. Similarly with visual input, your eye can subconsciously, reflexively follow stimuli if the brain perceives it to be a threat. So those are the corpora quadrigemina. Again, we're on the ventral view of the brainstem here. In addition to the corpora quadrigemina, the cerebral aqueduct I showed this in a different video, but the cerebral aqueduct is a passage that connects the third ventricle surrounding the thalamus, so coming over here, to the fourth ventricle, which is going to be just anterior to the cerebellum. So that's going to be another key anatomical piece running through the midbrain. And then lastly, the cerebral peduncles. So you can see them here. So there's actually a superior, middle, and inferior peduncle in this part of the brain. But I want to draw your attention to it over here. So the cerebral peduncles is going to be a passageway where the corticospinal tracts stem or branch. And so let me move this. And so what you're actually seeing here is passages coming from the primary motor cortex controlling skeletal muscle movement. So this is the very precise tracts. So remember, tracts are going to be bundles of axons in the central nervous system. So these axons are going to stem all the way from this primary motor cortex down through the cerebral peduncles and the midbrain. It's going to go through pons, medulla oblongata, and then you actually see it going out the ventral side of the spinal cord. Here it is. Ventral side of the spinal cord is going to be motor output, and we'll see that sensory input actually comes in the dorsal side of the spinal cord. But I wanted to point out those peduncles. They don't look very significant here, but you've got some really important tracks running through them, and I thought that was a nice illustration of some of those functions. So next up, the pons. So pons is referring to bridge. So fibers of the pons act as bridge both from the cerebellum to the brainstem, as well as we also see connections, as I indicate here, from higher brain centers, from the cortex to the spinal cord. So lots of white matter projections. And we're going to see that impulses can be relayed between the motor cortex and the cerebellum through this region as well. And that's really what we were seeing in that last graphic. But with this particular formation, I want to say a bit more on that. This particular formation controls the state of wakefulness in our body. And so I think it therefore makes a lot of sense that you have really widespread connections coming from this whole RAS, reticular activating system, and projecting far and wide to the cortex, to the thalamus, to the diencephalon, which we've just covered. You see that the reticular activating system is actually going to be inhibited by sleep, by alcohol, as well as by drugs. And so if you have damage to this region, that could result in permanent unconsciousness, which is going to be what we consider to be a coma. So another way to think about the reticular activating system is it is pivotal to filtering out the noise, if you will, in our environment. So repetitive stimuli, familiar stimuli, weak stimuli, about 90% of the stimuli coming through our body is going to be filtered out by this RAS so that our cortex doesn't have to be bothered by it. For example, clothing that you're wearing, you're not consciously thinking about the sensations coming from that. You're not consciously thinking about the pressure of the chair on your body. You're not consciously taking in a lot of distractions in our environment. And this RAS, we really have the RAS to thank for that variability. So moving on, the third region of the brainstem is going to be your medulla. So this is going to be critical to autonomic reflexes. So think about the autonomic system and its two branches, right? You've got the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, right? So these are our involuntary systems, right? So controlling smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, controlling glands. So you're going to have some really critical nuclei that are going to be embedded in the medulla. Just to highlight a few to illustrate and hone in on this point, you have a cardiovascular center here, which is going to be responsible for adjusting how forcefully, adjusting the contractility of the heart, as well as the heart rate. We also see that the cardiovascular center can control blood vessel diameter. And so these are going to play a big role in regulating blood pressure fluctuations. We know that blood pressure is one of those functions of the body that we have to regulate via homeostasis. And this is really the part of the brain that's going to be responsible for ensuring that we do maintain that so that we can ensure perfusion to all parts of our body, no matter what we're doing. In addition, another really critical one, the respiratory center. Don't worry about learning the details of this right now, but just to illustrate, so you have input coming from stretch receptors in your lung. You have receptors that are going to sense chemoreceptors in your lungs that can sense irritation, pH receptors, CO2 receptors. So those are going to be really important receptors that are going to communicate directly to the medulla, the pons as well, but with the medulla, that's a core concentration of nuclei in this region that allows us to control the rate of breathing, how deeply we're breathing, and ultimately the concentration of CO2 and oxygen in our blood supply. So really important parts of our body. You can see why damage to the brainstem can be so fatal because you no longer have the ability to control those respiratory functions as well as those cardiovascular functions. The last thing I want to talk about here is no longer part of the brainstem, but it's so closely linked anatomically. So again, pons, medulla, and here's the cerebellum. So running within the cerebellum, you have white matter it's referred to as the arbor vitae. So vitae means life, and arbor is tree. So an arboretum is a sanctuary for trees. And so just a little bit of Latin origin there. So this is the tree of life. And if you look at this in this graphic, but especially in a real specimen, you have beautiful branching of white matter tracks coming through this region. So that's the arbor vitae. A key role of the cerebellum is motor control and motor learning. So this region is pivotal to allowing us to coordinate complex movements. I like these descriptions, so you can think about this region as receiving plans or blueprints for movement from our primary motor cortex. But in addition, the cerebellum is going to be taking in information about our body's position in space. That's going to be coming from proprioceptive centers and our joints, coming from visual input, coming from our semicircular canals in our inner ear. So the cerebellum is coordinating all of that and allowing us to make these complex movements. If you think about it, the cerebellum is quite large. It makes up 11% of our total brain mass. And we are seeing more and more that it has branching that extends to the prefrontal cortex. So some neat connections here between higher order executive functions and this motor control and learning. So I'll stop it there, but hopefully that was a useful overview of the brainstem, its key basic functionality, as well as the cerebellum.